November 1st, 1954. That's the date of the beginning of the Algerian Revolution. We're just 2 weeks past the 60th anniversary of the date that marks the independence of Algeria. The French-Algerian War was the most bloody and violent decolonization struggle in an era when much of the colonial world shook off the shackles of European imperialism. Tonight, we consider the post-colonial aftermath of that struggle in what the Algerians called the dark decade of the 1990s. It would be so fabulous if all of you please turn your cell phones off. In the 1990s, Algeria was the first place to democratically elect political Islamists to power anywhere. Before Turkey, before Palestine, before Egypt, there was Algeria. When the military cracked down on this, a violent civil war ensued, and tonight we'll learn more about what went wrong and how reconciliation with political Islamists was achieved in Algeria. There may well be some of you tonight who are here at your first Communities in Conversation event. I want to encourage you please to leave with one of the postcards that we have in the back. We have programs like this that are free and open to the general public that take place over the course of this semester about every 3 weeks or so. We'll begin up again in January with a wonderful event with Scott Samuelson. In the spring semester, there'll be events just about every 2 weeks, including the third run of our Tournée French Film Festival. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, sign up on Instagram. It's an interesting place to be. These Communities in Conversation events are always a team project. Tonight was made possible due to the generous support of the Modern Languages and Literatures Department. Thank you, Eric Henniger and the French section, the Religious Studies Department, with special thanks to Yasser Kazi for reaching out to the broader Muslim community, and the International Studies Department for helping bring this to the attention of many students who are here tonight. How many students in international studies are there here tonight? Lots of you. How many French students studying French? Quite a number of you. Good. How many history students are here tonight? There we go. I'm in the history department. I couldn't pull this together without the team that works with me, my RSAPs, the amazing whirlwind of activity that is Brianna Summers, and my calm wind that is Suhad Altayak, and the rock, Jackie Baker. None of this would be possible without the support of the Rhodes Lecture Board that underwrites all CIC programming, but really the heavy lifting tonight was made possible by Professor Etty Terim from the History Department. She told me earlier that when Professor LeSueur visited her class, she was ambivalent because the students loved him. And she was a little bit worried that this would somehow limit the amount of love they feel for our extraordinarily charismatic modern Middle East historian. I don't think she's got anything to worry about. She teaches with extraordinary passion, and she has an enormous passion to make sure that not only our community, the Rhodes community, but the broader Memphis community has a more nuanced perspective on the realities and complexities of the Middle East. That's why she put together this Hillgron-supported series. She's interested in a critique of what Francis Bacon called the idols of the tribe. We have to get beyond the idols of the tribe if we're going to understand the modern Middle East, and that's what we're here to do tonight. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Professor Terem, who will introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you. My name is Terem, and I'm a professor of Middle East history at Rhodes. We have a wonderful evening ahead of us. I'm honored to introduce you to Dr. James LeSueur. Dr. LeSueur received his PhD from the University of Chicago and teaches history at the University of Nebraska. His research interests include colonial and post-colonial Algeria, France, European decolonization, and political Islam. He's the author of numerous books and articles. I was first introduced to LeSueur's work as a graduate student focusing on colonial and post-colonial North Africa. I benefited immensely from his first book on French and Algerian intellectuals during the Algerian War of Independence. As a professor at Rhodes, I have enthusiastically shared his thoughtful and intriguing works with my students. His work pushes us to think about the significance of the Algerian War in French and Algerian cultural, political, social, and intellectual history. It helps us to analyze how the French-Algerian colonial relations altered conceptions of identity and self-definition. And it teaches us a powerful lesson about the effects of violence, torture, terrorism, and military actions on the French and the Algerians. I am thrilled to have here with us tonight Dr. James LeSueur. His lecture entitled Between Terror and Democracy. Please join me in giving Dr. LeSueur a very warm welcoming.
Thank you for that, how would you say?
Introduction?
No, that's not quite the word. Today has been more than an introduction. It's been just an overwhelmingly positive experience. It's not very often that scholars get to come to talk about their work and to be received like this. This is a nice, huge audience. So it's more than just acknowledgement of being invited here. But I do want to say very specifically, I do take this invitation seriously. This is a very distinguished lecture series, and I'm honored to be here. Rhodes College is a great college. You have a fantastic history department. And so it's a great privilege for me to be able to come here and to speak to you. And specifically would like to thank Jonathan Judenkin, my comrade in intellectual arms. He and I have shared the field of French intellectual history for quite a while. And Terem, whom I got to know fairly well last night at dinner and then throughout the various things we did today. It's been fantastic. So I'd really like to express my gratitude to be here. It's truly an honor. Let me kind of begin by seeing if this works. This is a new PowerPoint presentation thingy for me, and I just want to make sure I got the buttons correctly, right? So let's just go to the first slide. It's always a privilege and a joy to be able to speak about Algeria to such a large audience. Americans sometimes forget that Algeria has played a very important role in American politics. And for this, I'd like to give you a couple examples. John F. Kennedy, I think you all probably recognize the face. Let me just make sure the pointer works. Here, John F. Kennedy, right? But what you can't see are the dates. That's December 1957. John F. Kennedy used Algeria to great effect on the floor of the US Senate to basically announce his presidential candidacy in 1957 because he took the stage on the floor of the Senate in order to denounce France for its colonial wars in Algeria. Kennedy argued very specifically that if France did not stop its war in Algeria, it risked destroying NATO itself and therefore risked destroying Europe because the Soviet snakes, whom he called the great enemies of freedom, were set to strike. And so he was very desperately afraid that if the war continued in Algeria, it would destroy the rest of the world. And he used that to announce himself among a certain group of people as a very serious contender for Democratic contender for president. So Kennedy's interesting, but Tehran, 1979, you'll probably remember that during the Iranian hostage crisis, it was the Algerians, not the Americans, not the enfeebled Carter administration, or the manipulative Ronald Reagan administration, or the scheming CIA a la Argo that secured the release of the American hostages. It was actually Algerian diplomats. The Algerian diplomats actually handled the money that was transferred. Americas, if you remember, paid a significant amount of money to secure the release of the 52 hostages that were held for 444 days in captivity in Tehran. And in fact, if you look at this slide, after the burning of the flag in the US Embassy, they landed first in Algiers. In other words, Algiers played a very significant role. Algerian diplomats played a very significant role in securing the release of the American hostages. Speaking of hostages, remember that even well before the arrival of ISIS and terrorist groups like that, the Maghrebian powers, the Ottoman rulers, used to demand tributes paid to them in order to avoid foreign vessels and their crews being taken captive and made into slaves in Algiers. The famous Cervantes spent 5 years in a prison in Algiers in the 16th century as a slave, and he was eventually ransomed back by his family. You might say, well, that's not America, it has nothing to do with America, but that's true. He was fighting, after all, for Spain against the Turks, and he probably deserved what he got. He was captured in battle, he was made into a slave. You can probably say, well, so what does it have to do with America? Well, in America, it's sometimes forgotten that America fought its first overseas adventures against Algeria. So in the war, the Barbary Wars, the two of them, from 1805 to, 1801 to 1805, under Thomas Jefferson, and then under James Madison, America fought a war against Barbary powers, very specifically Algeria, in order to break the policy of paying tributes. For example, in 1796, the Americans paid a tribute of $642,000, which is 1/5 of the federal budget at the time, as a tribute for the Algerians. That ended in the War of 1815 against the Barbary powers. Now, I could play the Marine Corps hymn, which you probably know. I thought about doing that, but I was adding too many things to the slide presentation, so I was advised not to do that. But the Marine Corps hymn does have something to do with that. But that's not enough to get you excited about America's relationship to Algeria. So let me add one more person, Abraham Lincoln, right? You might not remember that Abraham Lincoln sent the Emir Abdelkader a pair of dueling pistols. I like this, actually, it's kind of fun. He sent Abdelkader a set of dueling pistols in honor of Abdelkader's mission to stop a massacre in Syria in 1860. And so in honor and celebration for his intervention to stop this massacre of Syrian Christians in 1860, Abraham Lincoln sent his dueling pistols. And this is important because America then loved jihadis, right? I'm going to say that again. America loved jihadis. Abdelkader was a very famous, very loved, and very celebrated jihadi in the 1860s, in part because of his work on behalf of Islam to save Christians who would otherwise be massacred, right? And that's an important thing, but again, we have more to say about the American relationship with Algeria, so let's just go to this guy, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Remember that in 1942 and 43, the Allies used North Africa as the staging grounds for the fight against fascism in Europe, which means that the Allied planners, including Eisenhower and his staff, planned the operations for the defeat of Nazi Germany in Algiers, right? And you can see by the slide here, you can see all of the planning operations and communication networks that eventually went into this. So in other words, the defeat of Italy, the D-Day operations, et cetera, were all planned from Algiers, right? So all of this would suggest to you that we can go on, and in fact, we can go on and on about that relationship between Algeria and France, Algeria and America. But now we need to move to a different topic, Algeria today, which is the purpose of our meeting, to talk about how Algeria fits into our history and to the broader history of the world history today. So I would like to move into this contemporary era, this contemporary phase, and this is also the phase of the war on terror. So when we talk about this period in Algerian history, we're also talking about the beginning of the War on Terror. What's significant about that is Algeria predates our experience with the War on Terror by a decade. In other words, many of the lessons that we're talking about now have already been learned, or could have been learned, in the Algerian experience. I think it's really important to remember that. And in very specific terms, the things that we learn from Algeria, basically, is that Algeria was successful in creating new models for how to move through the War on Terror. And very specifically, for us, that Algerians were very adept in teaching us a model of how you don't do history. And that's significant. And it's something we're going to kind of focus on tonight. In fact, what they taught us was not a new model for the death of God, but for the death of history itself, which is very different. But speaking of the death of God, right, we will go to Friedrich Nietzsche, right? So you might be asking, what is this guy talking about? How does he move from Nietzsche to Algeria? Okay, so scholars have generally remained pretty ambivalent about Friedrich Nietzsche and his views on history. This ambivalence arises directly from Nietzsche's own attitude towards historians and scholars himself. And I urge the professional historians in this room, Jonathan included, not to take this too seriously. So this is, in other words, a threat. So what Nietzsche was arguing, he said, right, the scholar, he once wrote in his famously misunderstood work, Will to Power, is, quote, a herd animal in the realm of knowledge who inquires because he is ordered to do so and because others have done so before him, right? Yes, Nietzsche did argue this, but he also argued something else in an equally misunderstood and less read essay called On the Advantages and Disadvantages of History for Life. And he said the following, basically, historical scholarship can be dangerous. Among other things, it impairs instincts, allows each successive generation to make claims of superiority over past ones. It allows generations to view themselves with cynicism and irony. And furthermore, it directly contrasts the values of our age in the post-September 11th world. Nietzsche questioned whether or not his contemporary society could withstand the weight of what he called full consciousness. As he put it, quote, so my proposition may be taken and understood, only the strong personalities can endure history, and the weak are completely extinguished by it. History is, in Nietzsche's view, a major obstacle to life. Furthermore, history is an unnecessary burden because it can be used only in the service of life, he argued. Lastly, perhaps Nietzsche's greatest fear concerning history is that it does not allow societies the opportunity to forget. Let me say that again. It does not allow societies the opportunity to forget, right? For us, especially, again, those professional historians in the room, professional historians and scholars tend to regard Nietzsche's views of history with a great deal of skepticism, especially our contemporary era, which is oversaturated with historical works and historical confessions. Tonight, I will examine Algeria's very controversial decisions to prefer amnesty over truth in order to end a protracted civil war. And I'm going to use Nietzsche to kind of unravel a few of these things. But before I do so, I'd like to ask a couple of things. What did the Algerian government do that was so unconventional? And briefly, and later, in more detail, I'll kind of break it down. Under the current president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, in 1999, Algeria passed something called the Civil Harmony Law, which granted the first wave of limited but broad amnesty to those armed Islamists who would renounce violence. Then, in September 2005, Bouteflika passed something called the National Referendum, there was a national referendum passed for something called the Charter for Peace and National Reconciliation. This granted blanket amnesty to security forces, state officials, as well as Islamist terrorists, except those who raped, set off bombs in public places, or carried out massacres. Algeria's amnesty agreement required no public hearings, no truth commissions. The application of this law in 2006 went even further and prevented historical inquiry itself. I will elaborate in a moment, but before I do, I'd like to ask you to reevaluate a simple prejudice. The most unexamined prejudice is this. Given the pervasiveness of what Peter Brooks has called the confessional model in Western culture, the issue of rethinking the usefulness of truth is very difficult. As Brooks put it, quote, our age of confession has its origins in medieval Christian theology and practice. He goes on to say that specifically our contemporary notion of confession dates from 1215, from the Fourth Lateran Council, when the Roman Catholic Church mandated annual confessions. What Brooks says, basically, is that the confessional model is so powerful in Western culture, and I'm quoting, that even those whose religion or non-religion has no place for the Roman Catholic practice of confession, those people are nevertheless deeply influenced by it. Indeed, it permeates all aspects of our culture, including educational practices and our laws. In other words, we have come to expect it, confessions, from anyone, states or people, and given the ubiquity of this model, we now have gross and banal public forms of confession, including tabloids, TV programs. You remember Jerry Springer, right? Those are kind of evidence of the confessional model working itself culturally. So Brooks argues that we live in today in a generalized demand for transparency that entails a, quote, a tyranny of the requirement to confess, end quote. I quote Brooks not to appear as an apologist for the Algerian government, but in order to remind us just for a minute, to deconstruct ourselves just for a moment, that we are conditioned by our societal expectations regarding public confessions, so much so that we cannot but suspect a government that is willing to forgo them as a strategy to end violence. We are especially conditioned by the assumption that in post-conflict societies and post-conflict periods, each society moving beyond those must include confessional practices as a way of doing their business. I'm suggesting that we examine our own assumptions about truth commissions, but I'm not supporting the trivialization of Algerian violence, far from it. Nor am I supporting what the scholar Howard Ball has called a culture of impunity, a phenomenon in the recent years which, in the face of international courts, of international tribunals that protect human rights, little has been actually done to bring those accused of human rights violations to justice. It's fair to say that Nietzsche probably never would have expected his views of history to be taken up with such vigor by the Algerian government, or to be brought up in a weapon in the war on terror, but here we are tonight, nevertheless, to talk about this and suggest that we use Nietzsche as a point of departure precisely because his rather unconventional way of understanding history lends itself so well to an evaluation of Algeria's efforts to achieve national reconciliation. To be sure, Algeria chose another path forward, a path without truth, one that required a unique blending of amnesty and amnesia. But how and why did it choose such an unconventional path? Still, you might ask, why does it matter? Who cares? It matters for a very simple reason. As a nation that has been on the forefront of the battle against radical Islam for more than a decade, what the Algerian government does matters a great deal because having fought against radical Islamists for more than anybody else, one could argue, other governments facing similar threats today are looking for models. And very specifically, they have a chance of choosing between different kinds of models. And I would argue that the Algerian model seems to be the way of the future. And I'll elaborate. Egypt already gets an A+ for following this model, an A++. If you were to say any government in the world is looking at lessons from the past and applying them, it's the government of Egypt today. And I will be very specific about that. But in reality, the lessons have a longer history. All throughout the French colonial period, Algeria experienced tremendous and unprecedented violence. In the 1840s, the French violence against Algerians was so bad that it even sent its own parliamentary commissions to investigate what would surely be today called human rights violations or crimes against humanity. Alexis de Tocqueville was chosen by the French Parliament to investigate such crimes. And in the 1840s, the French even developed a word for them called razzia, even in parliamentary debates, to describe what would be called a total war policy against Algerian resistance. This was a total war strategy on the part of France to destroy all elements of resistance. Some cases were so bad that they became reported internationally. For example, they were called smokeouts. The French soldiers would lock up hundreds of Algerians at a time inside caves, light the caves on fire, and then seal the caves. Right? This became kind of an everyday policy tactic of the French military in the 1840s. Born in violence, the death of French Algeria was equally violent. During the War of National Liberation from 1954 to 1962, an estimated 1 million Algerians died. A good many, another example of French colonial violence, torture. A good many at the hands of other Algerians, such as the infamous Malouza massacre in 1957, when over 300 villagers in Algeria were slaughtered, not by the French, but by the FLN soldiers intent on stamping out rival resistance groups. It was unquestionably one of the most violent eras of decolonization fought, violence wars of decolonization fought, and during those 8 years, in addition to the 1 million people who died, 2 million more were put in concentration camps, what the French euphemistically called relocation camps. And by the end of the war, over 1 million European settlers left Algeria. With regard to the issue of the French colonial violence, the Algerian state has been entirely and unambiguously against amnesia. The Algerian officials have argued that the French military and government officials should be prosecuted in international courts for being war criminals, and the Algerian state has repeatedly insisted on the need for the French to come clean on its crimes. To this end, the Algerian government has used, to great effect, the works of historians, and gone so far to insist that the relevant historical archives be moved from France to Algeria. During the post-colonial period, the first president of Algeria was Ahmed Ben Bella, who served as a president for about 2 years. He was, in fact, a leader before that, but he became president in 1963. Ben Bella was immediately overthrown, or 2 years later, was overthrown by Henri Boumediene, who ruled over Algeria with an iron fist from 1965 to 1978 when he died. Algeria's one-party state, which Boumediene constructed as a dictator, was then directed, after his death, by Chadli Benjedid from 1979 to 1992. The Boumediene era was known for its one-party state, its bold social programs, but also its failure to create a vibrant socio-economic infrastructure that could sustain Algeria's future growth. First Ben Bella, then Boumediene. The two of those enacted what would become the official state practice of torture, and ingrained these into the security apparatus of the state. However, it was not until the Chadli era that the measurable cracks in Algeria's economy began to show, and by the 1984 OPEC crisis, when the world oil markets began to collapse, Algeria had already climbed into a deep economic pit from which it could not emerge. In 1988, after massive public riots broke out in October, the military reacted, killing over 500 unarmed civilians and protesters, and the Algerian regime quickly began to bow to public pressure to implement the long-awaited transition away from one-party rule. This was officially the first Arab Spring in North Africa and the Middle East since the era of decolonization. However, when Algeria finally embraced its own version of glasnost, it was so overwhelmed by the socio-cultural and political forces that it could not control. Amid deep economic crisis, Algerian variants of political Islam gained international attention in 1990 when the newly formed Islamic Salvation Front won the first round of local elections, municipal elections, and then by a clear margin of victory. The FLN began to become fairly nervous. The state went on the defensive. It outlawed campaigning in mosques and schools and scheduled the new national elections. When the first round of national elections were held in December of 1991, the feast beat the FLN by a clear margin of victory. The military regime struck quickly. The feast leaders, including Abbassi Madani and Ali Belhaj, were arrested along with thousands of their supporters, many of whom were put in concentration camps in the Sahara Desert. Some estimates put it around 10,000 people were swept up from 1991 to 1992 and put in jail. The government canceled the second round of what would have been the national elections. It suspended the liberal constitution of 1989 and installed a powerful military junta. The military intervention in January of 1992 set off a wave of Islamist movements. An estimated 60 or so groups emerged. They continued to radicalize, and many of those groups remain at odds with the current government. Mohamed Boudiaf was brought back. He was a respected exiled leader who brought back by the government to lead Algeria through the next phase. He assumed the presidency of what was called the High Committee of State in 1992, but was almost immediately assassinated in the summer of 1992. Boudiaf's assassination caused the state to rethink what it was going to do, so it adopted a new junta regime. The High State Committee was comprised of army officers, and it was ruled by those army officers until General Lamine Zaroul became president in 1994. Zaroul led Algeria from 1994 until 1999, when Algeria's current president, Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who was a popular FLN leader during the era of decolonization and after, came to power. So Bouteflika comes to power, and he was elected first in 1999. He was re-elected in April of 2004. Let me just scroll through this for a second. This is the era of post-colonial Algeria. So Bouteflika was re-elected for a third term in 2009, and now he's essentially president for life. There have been an estimated 200,000 Algerians who died during this conflict from the early 1990s until the late 1990s. Algeria became a site of unimaginable carnage, all kinds of crimes, unimaginable crimes as well. Gang rape, throat slitting, baby killing, torture, disappearing, the massacre of hundreds of villagers at a time. It is estimated that 10 times more people, 10 times more citizens fled the country than were killed during the conflict. This is now basically the equivalent to what's happened in Syria in terms of numbers. Roughly the same number of people have died at this point, and the same number of people have been displaced, more or less. So the flight out of the country, much of Algeria's professional classes, its elites, its doctors, lawyers, writers, professors, engineers, scientists, politicians of all walks of life chose a life of exile. Eventually, many of those citizens who could have been counted on to run a civil society in times of emergency vanished into an ever-growing Algerian diaspora in France, Europe, Canada, and the United States. Desperate to avoid being caught in the struggle between Islamists and the state security personnel, the vast majority of those people who left the country never returned. Today, its chief resource remains oil and hydrocarbon industries. In 2007, its industry figures were impressive and accounted for 95% of its exports, 60% of all government revenues, 30% of GDP. Its natural gas is the 7th largest in the world today. It is the 2nd largest exporter of natural gas. In oil, it ranks around 19th for known reserves, and it is around 20th for production. Shockingly, and this is part of the issue that I tackle in the book, it turned a profit during the War on Terror. So in addition to becoming a different model for how you do history, it's actually kind of a different model for how you make money during an age of terrorism. Very unusual story to that. So it's in this context that Algeria began to look for and figure out a way out of this crisis. In other words, it began to challenge assumptions about the relationship between truth and reconciliation. In a rather unique move, it threatened to use prison as a deterrent for historical inquiry, and it began to imprison journalists and other people who wrote unflattering comments about the state, of course, many times under different charges. Algeria could have chosen another path forward, a path saturated by history, a path taken, for example, by South Africa. But Algeria chose Nietzsche's path, probably without knowing it, and definitely without the same kind of commendable motives that Nietzsche would have had. This terrible period of bloodletting and complex war against civilians, against radical Islamists, became a major problem for international actors. It challenged all the assumptions and expectations for how states would move forward. Under the provisions of its 2006 legislation, which followed Bouteflika's Charter for Peace and National Reconciliation, which was passed again by a national referendum in 2005, the Algerian government declared, first video at this point, anyone who by speech or writing or any other act, this is a quote, exploits uses or exploits the wounds of a national tragedy to harm the institutions of the Democratic Republic of Algeria, to weaken the state or undermine the good reputation of its agents who honorably serve it, or tarnish the image of Algeria internationally, shall be punished by 3 to 5 years in prison and a fine of 250,000 to 500,000 dinars. But how did Algeria get this far from history? So in other words, historians who wrote about this, detailed what the Algerian state did during this conflict, were threatened for the first time with prosecution and jail and other crime, and paying fines. So how did it get this far from history and the truth? The first step came not from within Algeria, but from forces outside. Oh wait, not quite yet. The first stage in how it got to where its position on history came from here. In January of 1995, a Catholic community in Rome, the Santiago community, organized the first major conference to discuss peace. The important part about this is it was not organized by the Algerian state. It was organized by the opposition parties, including prominent members of the banned FIS movement. And they met to discuss Algeria's future, and they developed a plan for national reconciliation based on a couple of key points. They wanted, one, the investigation of human rights violations. They also wanted, and very importantly, the restitution of Algeria's democratic institutions. Let me say that again. This peace movement, developed by outside opposition groups, wanted the restoration of Algeria's democratic institutions. The Algerian junta reacted swiftly and out of hand. They rejected the Santiago peace platform out of hand, and by 1999 they formulated their response. That response came through the Bouteflika platform and was carried through by Bouteflika in the first round of the law and civil concord statutes that he initiated. These early amnesty agreements that Algeria worked out announced a departure from what we must call the truth model for history, the truth model of this particular platform. In 1999, desperate to avoid further confrontation, but also desperate to avoid criticism, Bouteflika encouraged terrorists to simply lay down arms. But what's really important about this terrorist agreement, this agreement, is that they could lay down arms and have impunity. They didn't have to publicly confess for anything. They just laid down their arms, right? There were 5 different kinds of laws that came into play at this point, or 5 different kinds of crimes: homicide, rape, setting off of explosives in public places, inflicting permanent disability, and collective massacres. Over 5,000 Algerians were granted amnesty under the provisions of the deadline that ended in 2000, and another 5,000 convicted prisoners were released with these simple amnesty agreements. Only those terrorists who were identified with bombs and massacres were prohibited from amnesty agreements. In other words, only if you set off bombs and only if you carried out massacres could you not be allowed to have amnesty, which meant that rape was still on the table, right? Now, the 1990 amnesty accords clearly did not mention the role of the state or the Algerian authorities themselves. In fact, the actions of the state security forces aren't mentioned at all. The most virulent of the terrorist groups rejected the amnesty accords out of hand. But, and this is really important, so did the human rights groups, the women's associations, and the main opposition groups that represented the parties that were excluded from the democratic process. First video. We're trying this new. Now, before I play this, I'd like to just say one thing about Malika Mokadem. She's a very prominent writer. She, an Algerian writer who lives in France, a medical doctor, but a very famous and well-known and respected novelist. So this particular clip is from a discussion I had with Malika Mokadem in France about how Algerians view this kind of amnesty that doesn't require people to actually acknowledge what they did. They just simply put down arms and they're granted amnesty. So this is a critique by an Algerian of amnesty. Okay.
Le problème, c'est que cette loi est venue alors qu'il n'y a eu aucun jugement, aucune tentative de mettre des mots et des condamnations sur des actes de barbarie sans nom, absolument terribles. Et les gens, dans des endroits, dans les villes, dans des villages, ils ont vu descendre des maquis, des gens qu'ils connaissaient et qui leur avaient, qui avaient tué l'un des leurs ou qui avaient fait des violences aux gens du village. Donc, si vous voulez, cette façon de tout effacer, sans jamais mettre des mots sur les violences qu'ont subies les Algériens et sans que la justice ait prononcé des sentences contre ces gens-là, je trouvais que c'était une façon terrible. C'était de nouveau mettre le couvercle sur une violence sans jamais que la justice ait pu se produire. Et que, au contraire, non seulement les intégristes ont été absous de ce qu'ils avaient fait, mais en plus, ils pouvaient être aidés et ils se pavanaient devant les autres en les narguant. Ça me semble assez terrible.
To put Algeria's 1999 and 2005 reconciliation plans into proper historical context, it's important to remember that since the end of the Second World War, states that have struggled to overcome the effects of unrest, civil war, and extreme violence against its civilians, including genocide, have increasingly sought political formulas that balance the need for immediate peace with the need for justice. Starting, ironically, in 1974 with Uganda's Commission of Inquiry into the Disappearance of the People of Uganda, established by President Idi Amin, followed by Bolivia in 1982, Argentina in 1983, and most well-known South Africa in the 1990s. Over 20 governments around the world have preferred a formula that incorporates truth commissions into a quest for peace. The South African process The South African process, embodied in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission based on Nelson Mandela's 1995 Promotion of National Unity and Reconciliation Act, remains the most well-known and was the most transparent model of them all. It was unique because it included public testimonies from both victims and aggressors. The pattern suggests that history was not only endurable, but became part of society's fundamental ontological structure for dealing with extreme and systemic violence. In the end, it was a debate about the relationship between history and historical knowledge as it related to the formula of post-conflict national identity. To be truly free in the future would require that citizens not only know their history, they would have knowledge of what happened in the very negation of freedom itself. Telling the truth was a choice that South Africans made, and telling the truth opened the door to the pathway to national healing. To have a healthy society meant for South Africa that one would become part of history and acknowledge one's collective and individual participation in society's crimes. The promise of amnesty was the incentive held out for those who were willing to confess, and many thousands requested amnesty. Far more people requested amnesty than the state initially predicted. For example, 7,000 people requested it, but the state only anticipated 200 applications at first, right? To have amnesty meant to be historical and to allow one's public confession to become a historical document itself. Clearly believing that the citizens were able to endure the recounting of past atrocities, the South African hearings and testimonies were also broadcast publicly by local, national, and international media. And its chief practitioner, Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu, and Alex Bahrain, as well as other leading reporters, including Angelique Krog, Desmond Tutu's books, this writer, one of my favorite writers ever, and Alistair Sparks wrote memoirs and reflections on the success and failures of South African truth commissions. as well as the relationship of truth commissions to their own lives. Again, the reward for South Africans willing to come clean about their apartheid crimes in public was amnesty, although sometimes amnesty was not granted, as is the very famous case of Stephen Biko, who was killed, but amnesty was not granted to his killer. Society's reward for a writer's willingness to record their own professional and personal views on the end of apartheid with nothing short of a general cultural transformation. The South African government correctly assessed its own public's maturity and readiness to move forward through the process of truth-telling that eventually led to amnesty for thousands. Importantly, it was not blanket amnesty, and it did have the requirement that one publicly confess and apply for amnesty. The cases had to be vetted in the courts. Of the many stated objections for truth commissions, perhaps none is more important than the desire to promote national reconciliation in post-conflict stages of development. Almost always the governments that decide to combine truth commissions and amnesty are transitional democracies that are believed to be stable enough to endure the period of truth-telling and amnesty proceedings. But what happens when the idea of truth and for reconciliation, what happens to the idea of truth for reconciliation when the government is still unstable, when it came to power through a military coup that suspended the democratic process, arrested and banned legitimate political actors, when the observers and citizens continue to see it as autocratic and intolerant, when the regime's critics are imprisoned, when it continues to witness violent terrorist attacks against it, what happens when the terrorist attacks against the state are undertaken by radical Islamists with increasing ties to networks like Al-Qaeda. In other words, what happens when we're talking about Algeria? This is not to suggest that the Algerian politicians of the past would, as they say, have a different Sonderweg explanation for their motives. Far from it. Even if Algeria's position in amnesty and national reconciliation debates are specific, it might still well become the model for how one moves forward in the war on terror. In other words, it can determine and affect how other nations are thinking to move forward in such conditions. For example, just the United States. In fact, the United States Assistant Undersecretary of State for Middle East Affairs, William Burns, said during a visit to Algeria in 2002 that Washington had much to learn from Algeria on the way to fight terrorism. Indeed, but what kind of lessons will they be? And will they be historical? The question of blanket amnesty is more troubling when the amnesty agreement specifically precludes inquiries into the past. And because Algeria was a signatory for many international conventions regarding human rights, it had a well-defined duty to look into potential human rights violations. Under international human rights law, and because it had signed many of these laws, it was required that it would uphold and facilitate investigations into alleged crimes. It did not. The international organizations such as Amnesty International and Algeria Watch have asked for these investigations, but have never been successful in forcing these investigations through the UN or other international authorities. In fact, prior to the September 2005 referendum, Amnesty International published an online public statement, quite unusual in this particular case, that said the Algerian president, Bouteflika, had called for a referendum to, quote, obliterate the past. Quote, the lack of any commitment to investigate the grave abuses committed during Algeria's internal conflict raises serious concerns that the proposed measures will perpetuate a climate of impunity and ultimately encourage further abuses in Algeria. To be sure, one of the key criticisms of the human rights groups is that the application of amnesty very specifically precluded investigations into security forces' actions. State officials were granted amnesty with sweeping provisions. This, according to most observers, leads one to argue that the state was interested more in shielding itself from potential persecution than it was in moving to reconciliation. For its dirty war tactics became a major part of the critique of what the regime was doing. Many people wrote about it. There were books that were now being published, in fact, called The Sale de Guerre, Dirty War. And these brought out enormous discontentment among writers who were looking at this and really looking at it with a great deal of suspicion what Algeria was doing. Second slide. Second video, please.
En 1988, il y a eu les grandes émeutes d'octobre 88. où l'armée a tiré sur des gens et a surtout beaucoup torturé. Et moi, je me rappelle, je faisais partie, donc on avait fondé à cette époque-là le comité algérien contre la torture, on avait réuni des documents, des témoignages, et on avait publié un livre qui s'appelait Le Cahier noir d'octobre. Donc on parlait des tortures qui avaient été faites par l'armée algérienne. Et nous avions demandé la légalisation de notre comité. Donc on s'est adressé, moi je me rappelle, moi personnellement, d'autres, on avait fait beaucoup d'efforts pour obtenir cette légalisation, parce qu'on voulait que les responsables qui étaient souvent désignés nommément, je veux dire, dans les témoignages, soient jugés. Eh bien, nous avons obtenu, on a fini par obtenir la légalisation du comité. Mais on l'a obtenu quand? Quelques jours après l'amnistie officiellement proclamée pour les événements d'octobre. Ce qui fait, c'est quelque chose de récurrent dans l'histoire de l'Algérie. À chaque événement sanglant, il y a une amnistie. Et la culture de l'amnésie, c'est quelque chose de consubstantiel à l'histoire de l'Algérie. Il n'y a pas de leçon, l'histoire ne sert pas de leçon. Et à chaque fois, ça va en s'aggravant, parce que les tortures de 88, ça a fait combien de victimes? Au total, 500 morts à peu près, peut-être je ne sais pas le chiffre exact, mais je dirais peut-être le même nombre en termes de gens torturés. Puis, comme les gens se sont aperçus qu'en réalité, il n'y avait pas de suite juridique, que vous pouviez tout faire, on est passé au stade suivant. L'assassinat de masse, la torture d'un côté comme de l'autre, et ça a donné quelque chose comme 200 000 morts, sans aucun impact.
To summarize, Algeria's current crisis began with the cancellation of the nation's first democratic elections. This spawned radical guerrilla groups, most infamously the GIA. The GIA, as it was then called, was a large umbrella organization. Group Islamic Army is what it stands for. The GIA was a large umbrella organization whose goal it was to take out the illegitimate junta power. Its goals were local and not primarily international. Eventually, the GIA fizzled out, and many grew wary of the perpetual jihad. Another group formed, the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, and that emerged around 1988. The GSPC, as it was then called, had vast terrorist networks in Europe and also in Canada and the United States, and opposed the 1999 Reconciliation Accords and vowed to keep up the fight against the state. The Salafists remained committed to the notion of jihad until the Algerian state and its supporters could be removed. By March 2002, its links to Al-Qaeda placed it on the US government's international terrorist networks list, and the GSPC eventually formally merged with Al-Qaeda in September of 2006. In January, it renamed itself Al-Qaeda in the land of Islamic Maghreb. Its leader put his views of reconciliation this way, and this is a quote: "Our beloved Commander bin Laden, rejoice, for we are hurting our enemies just like they are hurting us. We are fighting and wearing them out according to a carefully devised plan. We ask Allah to help us and guide us. As for their plans, they have failed one after the next. You have heard us, and you have heard about the failure of the deceptive reconciliation plan that Bouteflika and his generals gambled on. Allah knows how many men they have recruited and how much money they have raised for this plan, only for their desire to stop jihad. Today their plan is nothing more than dust blowing in the wind or a simple bedtime story. The failure of this plan is the topic of public and private conversations." And he goes on, "As for the second message, I would like to relay this through my speech, a message for Bouteflika and his chosen accomplices. You have clearly chosen your camp, and we have clearly chosen ours. You have made yourself the ally of this nation's enemies. You have actively joined the war against Islam, led by America, the leader of the infidels. You have made friends with the enemy of yesterday, France, and you have opened up wide the doors for the infidel companies that plunder our oil and gas. As the September opposition to the amnesty laws. As the AQIM attacks in September and April of 2007 point out, there would be a continued campaign by Al-Qaeda in Islam in the land of Islamic Maghreb against the government. Most recently, in January 2013, the hostage crisis at the Yemeni gas plant near Libya, during which the Al-Qaeda group directed by Mokhtar overran the Algerian security forces, held 800 hostages until they could be liberated. They did this in order to unsettle the balance of power in what is now become a very tumultuous post-Arab Spring world. I'm going to close with a couple other comments. Yet the hope of Algerian officials overseeing Algeria's government today is that amnesty and not the investigation of truth will help the country and help the country keep from plunging forward into a deep river of revenge. But in deciding on this very unusual tactic for the solution to a crisis, it started a quarrel over the role of history itself. Discussions of amnesty, however, are nothing new. For example, in post-Civil War America made provisions for granting amnesty to those soldiers who rebelled against the Republic. President Carter pardoned draft dodgers who refused to serve in the Vietnam War. And still more recently, the decision by the Iraqi government to pardon American forces and soldiers in the Iraq War, the recent Iraq War, led to eventually in 2006 for Iraq to grant amnesty to those jihadists who fought against the American troops. This might not have been the best thing to do, given what's happened right now. Yet before September 11th, most countries around the world spoke of historical inquiry, and that inquiry into the past became a vital ingredient for reconciliation. Historical inquiry involves access to archives, state records, and the use of victims' testimonies. A key incentive for most of these governments in the past has been that truth commissions, as Priscilla Hayner points out, is that truth commissions and scholarly investigations all work towards an international organization or international agreements that basically target oppressive regimes and met them out. In other words, these truth commissions helped identify countries as people who are not going along with international norms, and they were important, right? As a result, governments have been held accountable, more accountable, and in the international community and these international truth commissions are basically preferred methodology for deploying distributive justice. The problem today, as I see it, is this is changing. It's changing for a number of reasons. Things have changed a great deal in the past decade with the very real threat of international terrorist groups like we've just seen. New and increasingly dangerous threats are emerging in the chaos of the Arab Spring. Consequently, there's a noticeable relaxation of the tension and the pressures of these regimes to come clean, which means that these questionable human rights violations go unnoticed, especially in Egypt today, right? Western governments evince far more concern about the threat of radical Islamists than they do for the standards of human rights around the globe. Hence, at the very least, in the immediate future, I don't think that we can count on the West to increase pressure on these groups to enact more investigations into crimes against their people. On a final note, one of the most remarkable things that come out of the Bouteflika's reconciliation programs is an opposition book written by Saad Bahladid. The book is called L'Algérie, le prix de l'oubli, Algeria, the price of forgetting. And it suggests that the government has never fully understood the effect of violence on its citizens. Not once, she points out, did any Algerian chief of state ever visit the thousands of sites of massacres to express their condolences for the victims. Not once. Yet, those helpless populations, and she's very clear about this, those helpless populations are the very people who are expected to endorse a policy of reconciliation, a policy of amnesia. That being the case, it's also within this population is a search of way forward for peace in Algeria. So she says that we must submit to a different kind of requirement. And she suggests that Algeria must not be allowed to forget these crimes. Now, in order to return to one of the motives or one of the original thoughts of this talk, I'd like to return to Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche suggests that since history is too great of a force for most people to bear, that we need certain people to help us think through it. So we need artists. This is a kind of Nietzsche subversion to the whole paradigm. So in other words, while it's worth pointing out the Algerian official view Algerian citizens not able to hold up to scrutiny, there are certain people who have. And it's more incumbent on those people to resurrect the dead in order to speak about these past crimes. So very specifically, these people, we've become more reliant on these folks. In other words, not historians per se, but the writers who continue to write about these crimes. This is a list of books that I've given to you. I've given you quite a lot of time to think about them. But these are a list of books that I'd recommend about the Algerian Civil War, and these are mostly novels, right? Now, in order to kind of follow the Nietzschean moment, I'd like to reflect on what an artist thinks about what they have to say about this moment. So what I'd like to do is end with a very tiny little quote by an artist who wrote novels, one of those people on the list who wrote novels about the Civil War. Okay.
Il est vrai que moi, toute mon écriture est simple. J'ai essayé d'expliquer où est l'absurdité de la mort, ou de dire l'absurdité de la mort des gens comme Adjaout, comme Aloula, comme Mejdoub, comme beaucoup d'autres copains anonymes qui étaient inspecteurs de langue française, par exemple. L'Ayashi Youssef, qui a été tué à la sortie de l'inspection académique. Et j'ai énormément de copains. Mon frère, de père et de mère, mon frère aîné. Donc, toute mon écriture était d'essayer de démonter les mécanismes de cette mort absurde. J'essayais d'expliquer l'absurde, de rationaliser l'absurde. En hommage à eux, non, mais pour la liberté de leur âme, je ne sais pas comment le dire, mais je sentais ça comme quelque chose qui était un devoir absolu pour moi. Et que si ma vie devait servir à éclairer ça, c'est ça qu'il fallait que j'éclaire. Il n'y avait plus d'autres préoccupations. Quand on veut écrire des choses, quand on part écrivain, on se sent habité par la vie. Et subitement, moi, je me suis retrouvé habité par la mort, par des macabres, par des cadavres que je dois justifier la mort. C'était à moi d'expliquer ça, c'est à personne d'autre. L'explication de ceux qui les ont tués ne me satisfait pas, elle est injuste. L'histoire est injuste, parce que même l'histoire ne justifie pas ça. Quelle histoire qui justifie cet assassinat? Qu'est-ce qui explique ça? Elle reste inconnue. C'est comme une maladie d'un diagnostic terrible, et qu'on n'a pas le diagnostic. Donc j'ai passé mon temps à diagnostiquer cette mort et à essayer de la dire. Voilà ce qu'il y a derrière tous mes écrits, jusqu'à présent, et peut-être très longtemps encore.
This is the author that was just speaking. So his book, Last Night of a Damned Soul, which is translated in English, is highly recommended. This is what the book tries to capture. And that's the end of my presentation. A long, arduous path. Okay, yeah, I'm willing to take lots of questions, if you want. And I encourage you to ask some questions. Yeah?
Thank you very much for that amazing presentation. I appreciated it. And I agree with you as well that amnesty is definitely a way forward. Let me ask a question on a slightly related topic. We didn't quite get there. What if somebody were to say that from the perspective of the opposition, let's say the moderate jihadists in their terms, if they were to ask what right does Bouteflika have to offer us amnesty, when the fact of the matter is that we should have been in power, and and the excesses of the government probably exceed, from their perspective, the excesses that they have done. And they seem to get off scot-free, i.e. the junta. Whereas the amnesty being offered to those who, from their perspective, were defending their right, if you like, to come to power. How would you respond to that charge? And another way to phrase that is, at what point does some type of legitimate resistance become justified?
Well, that's what we've been. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think the statement more or less gets this issue of at what point do the Islamists who were banned, who were legitimate political actors, who were disenfranchised by the military, at what point does their resistance through jihad represent a legitimate political action? That was, I think, part of it. And then one of the questions then is, well, is it okay for the state, which is an illegitimate political actor, according to them, to grant us amnesty? Is that a fair transaction, right? And I think that that's a good question because it's certainly one of the questions that a lot of those people ask. I've been in rooms with them and they ask that question, right? Why did we have to accept amnesty? Why would we do that from a state? Now, what I didn't really kind of go into detail is just how complex these amnesty agreements were. When a lot of people laid down arms and accepted the 1999 agreement, again, there was opposition because there were rapists that were granted amnesty, right? And the women's groups rallied against that, and then by 2005, rape was one of the things you couldn't get amnestied for, right? That was because the international human rights groups militated to include that, right? Now, the fact is that a lot of those people who laid down arms simply were fatigued by the war, just like the state was fatigued by the war. And so they were also, in many cases, they were paid to lay down arms. They received financial benefits for doing so. And that was just one of the agreements that the government had with those people. But getting to the point of whether or not it's legitimate, I think that's part of the debate that's taking place, at least within certain groups. For example, in Egypt, that's why I brought up the comparison with Egypt, where Egypt sees a very parallel, the Egyptian story is parallel now to Algeria, almost line by line. So when I say that people were observing this and watching it, the Egyptian state has clearly watched what the Algerians did and got away with, and has replicated it, right? So this was a laboratory that was then replicated by other people, right? And so in a certain sense, I'm not sure, because what you're asking is, at what point does resistance, including armed insurrection against the state, become legitimate if the state has acted in an illegitimate way, right? Which is the debate, among Algerianists and among Algerians. This is a hugely controversial topic because a lot of people, in fact, I have many, many things I could show you where people say, well, the state was completely within its legitimate actions to do what it did because the Islamists, it claimed, were going to institute Sharia, cancel all democratic processes thereafter. One man, one vote, one time was the expression, right? And therefore cancel all elections. So it did it to save democracy, right? Now, that's the debate. And there are two sides of that. Those people who don't accept that and the people who do accept it. And it's by the time that the amnesty agreements happened in 1999, the country was fatigued, right? I didn't really do my slides really great because it's the first time I've never used PowerPoint before. Really strange to say, but I don't use PowerPoint. And I did, but I missed the slide where I was showing you those victims, the corpses, and so on and so forth, the number of people who were buried. This was an amazingly difficult time, right? So most people would agree that by 1999, the country was tired. It needed to end this war, right? Now, and a lot of Islamists also agreed that, but some people, especially those who were in exile, who rejected it out of hand, believe that they never should have, they had no business apologizing for anything, and there was no apology demanded, because they hadn't done anything wrong, right? And that's just the debate that's taking place. It's taking place within Egypt today and elsewhere, where these things are now reoccurring. And I think, for example, just to give another example of America, right? Because I started with America, try to feed into discussions, but in Afghanistan today, one of the principal sticking points for the withdrawal of American troops and the staying of American troops in Afghanistan is exactly this, right? Would they be given amnesty? This is what President Obama wants, if these troops, residual troops, stay in Afghanistan, they have to be granted amnesty, right? And this is part of an ongoing discussion. What's the role of amnesty, right? I think part of what I said, maybe I didn't say it very, very clearly, is that we've clearly gone down this other path for a couple decades. We were moving towards truth. We were moving towards truth as a way to get reconciliation, right? That's changed though. The war on terror has completely changed that paradigm, right? The urgency of the wars, threats that where people are under assault, the kinds of things that are out there, the terrorist groups, networks, ISIS, and so on and so forth, have completely erased that concern for human rights, right? For the most part, it's a really different world than it was, say, 15 or 20 years ago, before all this stuff happened. That was the world where you could put pressure on governments if they didn't go along with reconciliation accords that were public, right? And that after 1989, Priscilla Hayner says, after 1989, that became part of international affairs because you could expect people to be held accountable. But we can't expect people to be held accountable in the same way because of the threat of radical Islam, right? I think that's to me a really alarming feature of the debate today. At what point do we hold people accountable when the enemies are so dreadful? ISIS, sex slaves, those kinds of enemies, right? Does that answer your question? Kind of. Well, we get the chance to talk about it over dinner, so. Any other questions? Yes, yes.
Kind of following up on that, as you said earlier about Egypt.
Right.
How do you see, say, with the Arab Spring revolutions and this process playing out or not playing out? How does that fit into that paradigm? So Egypt will take on.
Okay. I think Egypt is a really, really interesting question. And the way that fits in very clearly to me is, as an Algerianist, and I've been saying this for a couple of years, that you could see Egypt doing exactly what Algeria had done, right? Elections, cancellation of elections, right? Military intervention, asking people to have these public referendums on what they've done, and so on and so forth, right? So Egypt is important because in Egypt, one of the concerns is what happens to the youth who were part of that opposition movement, right? And I think most of us are terrified. We had this conversation last night. A lot of us are terrified because the youth that was so optimistic in those protests, right? They fought, they died for the right of politics in modern society after the fall of Mubarak, right? Their world has been turned upside down because the junta stepped in, right? And they overturned legitimate elections, right? And now, of course, there's debate. What would the Muslim Brotherhood going to do, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, they overturned and overthrew a government, right? In the defense of something else, right? And I think that part of the debate in Egypt for me is that it's clearly going down a path where it's following this Algerian model. And I'm guessing that the next phase of it will be how you deal with reconciliation, how you deal with amnesty, how you deal with the other parts of it, right? At the same time, there's an emerging threat because a lot of those people who were protesters against the regime, who were out in the streets opposing and trying to bring about a democratic polity, are now arrested and they're joining militant groups, right? So for me, the logic is really clear, right? The similar thing is also happening, not the state, but also the armed groups that are forming and opposing the state look similar in their trajectory to what happened in Algeria, right? Now, the difference in Algeria, I think is kind of interesting, is Algeria was primarily a local jihad. And I know that a lot of people don't really maybe understand that. What I mean is their principal objective in the jihad that the armed groups fought was to overthrow the state, right? It was not to enact some international jihad against, all infidels and so on and so forth. It was to overthrow a state that had claimed power illegitimately, right? That was the principal motive. In fact, there are really famous examples where Al-Qaeda tried to get control over Algeria's jihad, tried to influence what they're doing, and the Algerian jihadists said, no, we are a nationalist jihad, right? And if you come here, try to intervene on us, we'll kill you, right? this is how intense that nationalist jihad was for Algerians, which I think is kind of lost on a lot of observers because we don't really understand that its primary motive was to overturn the state. So going back to this question about whether it was legitimate, that's the debate that's taking place, right? And I've had people say, well, if you do interviews with some of these people who are accused of being part of these terrorist networks, then you're supporting that terrorist network. Well, I'm an historian just trying to document what's happened, and I think you have to have a clear understanding of what the state did, right? And the state suppressed democratic elections. And so that leaves the population a certain degree of frustration, and I think a lot of people who were otherwise optimistic are now pessimistic, the youth, right? And if they turn in the direction of jihad, we have a big problem, right? Yes?
I know you presented some of this material to State Department officials.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about Samantha Power,
Mm-hmm.
A Problem from Hell, which gave her a certain credibility that led to her becoming the ambassador to the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
When she wrote that book about America's response to genocide, or its failure to respond to genocide in most cases, and mass murder, her point was that you could construct a foreign policy that was closely wedded to a conception of human rights.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a debate inside American foreign policy thinking that goes in a different direction for what you're suggesting is the policy to sort of agree that amnesty and forgetting and a certain Nietzschean approach to the past is the way to go in contexts that seem dangerous, like when you might lead to the election of political Islamists and
Yeah, I cannot at all get in the State Department's mind, right? So in other words, I don't determine policy. I just simply talk about civil rights issues, So I wouldn't be able to anticipate what the State Department's actually thinking when it involves itself in these matters, right? But it's clear that the State Department is concerned with human rights, right? But the problem is that you've got these regimes now, like for example, Egypt is a perfect one, right? Where the Egyptian question also is not unallied to other questions. It's connected to, a relationship to other countries. It's connected to geopolitical space in a certain way. And it makes it very difficult to go through with a human rights objective, right? When you're talking about not just human rights, but basic security issues, right? And I think that the State Department has been kind of betwixt and between on this issue. I'm not particularly comfortable with how the State Department's dealt with Egypt, for example. In fact, I don't like how the State Department's dealt with Egypt. And my critique is very simple. If we allow these regimes to have legitimacy through our dialogue, remember there was a debate, should we break ties with Egypt after the crackdown? Is it a coup d'etat, right? Remember that? If you call it a coup d'etat, then legally that triggers certain kinds of things, right? Remember that of course it's a coup d'etat. Egypt overthrew a regime with the military. What is that exactly if it's not a coup d'etat? But legally we couldn't call it that because if we did that would enforce this human rights agenda, right? So we sidestepped in, and I think Obama has been really tragically erroneous on this, right? Because the point is here, who are you trying to capture? Who are you trying to influence, right? If you stand up, even like in terms of rhetoric, stand up for these people who are downtrodden, the people trying to push through on a democratic agenda, even if it's political Islam, right? It's still democratic. I think that the problem is that Obama's clearly kind of stepped too many directions. It's not clear at all the signals that he's sending. And when you have the government in the United States, which after all is a very powerful government, not sending clear signals that it will defend this, at least in rhetoric, you're sending too many mixed messages. And those youth that normally might go in this direction of democratic reform are now thinking of alternatives, right? Because we clearly seem to have abandoned principles. And I think that that's kind of my discomfort with Obama's strategy and his foreign policy advisors, quite frankly, who blew the Arab Spring. I think blew it. And this means something when you blow that. So. Question, yes?
What should they
taken a bigger stance, been more vocal, that they will support democratic opposition, that they will be more receptive to political Islam, that they wouldn't be so frightened by it. They wouldn't be conditioned by these other kind of geopolitical things they have to think about, relationships with other countries, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and so on and so forth. Those are the primary determinative factors in what happened, I think, with Egypt. And there's a long history for that. So I think what I would have liked to see is a more aggressive stance for democratic reform and democratic freedom. And we just didn't see it. I didn't see very much. I mean, we had a couple statements, but it wasn't a big platform issue. Remember, and it's ironic because if you think about what Obama did, he went to the University of Cairo, gave these speeches, right? So he was there before, speaking and talking about this stuff. But where was he when we needed him? It just wasn't there. And I think that that's a major failure in foreign policy. When the leader of the so-called free world is just not there, saying stuff that needs to be said, that's a problem, I think.